start off. And we'll kick off with, see if it pops up. I'm Yuri Timmermans. I'm CEO and founder of Big Jump, and I love helping businesses to become more agile and innovative. And I'm co-organizer of the Lean Business Strategies Meetup.
I'm John Stathakis, and I'm an independent software project manager. And Yuri and I are facilitating the session today. We just wanted to thank all of the guys that have helped to make today happen, and specifically on this being a collaboration between the Lean startup communities and the Agile communities, and also the other ones that I mentioned there. But I'd specifically like to call out on my side the Sydney Scrum user group. And I wonder if we can all, I don't know if you can see everyone's face, but if everyone can maybe wave their hands if they're from the Sydney Scrum user group. You can see how many guys we have from there. Welcome. And also from the Everything Agile Sydney, if you guys can wave as well. Welcome to you guys. And also from the Agile Brisbane Meetup, if you guys can wave on your side. Oh, that's great. Thanks, guys. Okay, Yuri, back to you.
Yeah, if we can just look at the other group that we've got is from Lean Business Strategies. Just put your hand up if you're from the Lean Business Strategies group. And then we've also got Australia. This is also supported by Australian Computer Society, so that's great having that support, as well as the Project Management Institute. So if you could put your hands up if you're from one of those organisations.
Wow.
That's great.
And then there's River City Labs as well.
Thank you to Beck Norton. So Beck is going to be producing a visual recording of today's event. So that'll be made from the recording, and that'll be available to us in the next few weeks.
All right, just a bit of ground rules in the agenda. We aim to finish at around 5:15, but we welcome discussions afterwards as well. So please stay around if you want to talk about anything that's related to this session. We are recording this session. It's looking at trying to make a summary as well at some point for other viewers that can't make it. So the ground rules is mute unless participating. We may also make some snapshots for distribution, and we encourage people to put their videos on. It just makes the engagement a bit more real. Please participate in the activity exercise that's part of this. And if you may not be able to participate if you're on your phone, or if you're on a corporate laptop on a network, because we'll be using Mural as a tool. So first of all, it's at 4 o'clock, we'll kick off Why Test Your Business Ideas. Then we're going to do an experiment sequence, as that's an exercise. We'll do some Q&A there. And then we'll finish off with what we've got coming up in the next month or so. And then we aim to close at 5:15.
Mm-hmm.
So just to introduce David before we kick off, taking decisions in a highly uncertain business environment is uncomfortable and can be risky. Efficiency seems to be the most urgent goal as that we're seeing in the pandemic. Is the old tried and tested approach still applicable? Yeah, should we actually use more of experimentation to test your business ideas and take decisions based on data that you really gather? David Bland, CEO and founder of Precoil. He advises companies on how to find product market fit using lean startup, design thinking, and business model innovation. As I met David in San Francisco during the Lean Startup Conference in 2017, first spoke to him, and he mentioned that he'd been working on a large experiment library for testing those business ideas. And then 2 years later, It's really good to see that he's actually co-authored the book with Alexander Osterwalder called Testing Business Ideas. And Alexander Osterwalder is the creator of the Business Model Canvas and the Value Proposition Canvas. When I saw the book being released in 2019, in November, I got back in touch with David and asked him if he would be interested in presenting at the Australian Meetup. So he's kindly agreed, which is absolutely awesome, and I think it's fantastic. David's a bit more about David, as he's pioneered General Electric's FastWorks program with Eric Ries. And what I really find interesting is he even mentored Toyota on lean startup practices. So Toyota is the creator of lean practices, so that's quite amazing. David spent 10 years of his career at technology startups. He stays connected to the startup scene through his work at universities and several Silicon Valley accelerators. I'd like to welcome David in this workshop and demonstrate some of the concepts of experimentation and how you test your business ideas. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I can't remember, it's 2017, it's all a blur, but it's so interesting to meet folks, like-minded folks at that conference. It's been really fun, and it's kind of crazy when you think about it. It's been 10 years or so, I think, almost 10. Yeah, last year was 10 years since that stuff was kicked off. So you would think 10 years is a really long time, but in a way, we're sort of all early adopters still. Like, it's still not common practice, you know. So today I'm going to talk, you know, a little bit about the book, and I'm going to share this mural screen, and you all will get a link to jump into this later on too. But basically, I didn't want to bore you with slides today, so I'll walk through this. We'll do some drawing, do a little bit of lightweight exercises, as Yuri said, and then we'll have a Q&A. So timings are pretty close, but you know, if we have more Q&A, there are worse things. So a couple things about Mural. When you do get in there, it's just basically double click to create stickies is pretty much all you need to know. You can double click and basically create the stickies when we start the exercises. I have this box called Google It. If there's anything that comes up during the talk, sometimes I ramble and I will talk about other books and other things. I will do my best to drop them in here. And so we could have at least a record of all the stuff I ramble on about, or if you have a great question and I have a link that I want to share, we'll drop it in there. And then also, as we sort of start wrapping up, I think any questions you have, you can also drop them in here when you get access to it, or in chat, either way. But it'll just help us kind of collate and you know, figure out what questions to kind of answer based on how many we have. Okay. All right. So you know, before I jump in too much here, you know, I learned all this the hard way. I don't know how else to describe it. You know, the first startup I joined, we thought we were a B2C startup, business to consumer, and we ended up being a B2B startup. So we were in fintech, and it was an 8-year journey, and we were acquired in 2006 for 16 million, which is not a life-changing event kind of exit, but it's pretty good. You know, we actually found traction and did some good work. But I think it really shaped my career and my thinking, because it didn't matter how many nights and weekends I was up coding things or designing things. At startups, you do it all, right? Testing things. It didn't matter. If people didn't want it, they didn't want it. So it really didn't matter how much work I did, how polished it was. It still failed, you know? And so we didn't really call it a pivot back then. We just didn't want to move in with our parents. So we sort of like realized along the way that financial advisors really liked our technology, and we started selling to them, and that's when we took off. And I've worked at a couple other startups where we didn't do that. We kept persevering no matter what, and we failed in kind of a big way. And I think there's this kind of mythos around you keep persevering and you'll finally just create that market and it'll all work out. But those cases are really rare. If you just keep persevering and ignoring data, this stuff doesn't always work out well. So a lot of my thinking, I was kind of like introduced to Agile at that first startup. I can't really pinpoint how I was actually introduced, other than our CTO was like, "We're Agile, that was your training." And I was like, "Oh great, there's no stress there. I'm trying to release software that transfers like $1 billion of premiums a month over the internet. And if we mess up some stuff, we're probably gonna get sued." So I sort of learned like trial by fire Agile, and I learned a lot of bad habits. So finally, after I kind of left that startup, I realized, hey, there's probably a better way of doing Agile. I got really involved in the Agile community. I've been speaking there since like, I don't know, at the big conference in 2010. And really into like the lean startup movement and design thinking. So I think all this really complements each other. So what I talk through today, no matter what kind of role you're in or what kind of org you're in, I hope you can find some nuggets that help you kind of take some learnings away from today. So one of the big things that Alex and I realized in kind of writing the book was people have been using the business model canvas. It also is 10 years since the first book. And we realized that, you could add some layer of thinking to the tool. And I think where people kind of mess up is just really how to use it in a way where they see their risk and they see the relationship between risk. So quite often, I'll draw a little bit for you here. I start kind of in the middle with, what's your value proposition? So no matter you're a big company or a startup, or you have a side hustle and you're doing something nice on weekends on the side, you need to know what your value proposition is. And it's not always your product. I would say 9 times out of 10, it's not your product at all. It's the benefit of your product. So the reward that people get out of it, the perceived benefit. And so I almost always start there and then go over to who is your customer, okay? And so you can do it interchangeably, but no matter what you're working on, if you're pitching to a VC as a startup, or a VP if you're inside a big company, you need to be able to say, what am I doing? So what's the value I'm creating and who's it for? Okay. And so I think sometimes the mistake people make with tools like this, especially in Western cultures, we go left to right. And I would almost never start with key partners first, because key partners is literally like probably the last thing you would want to like really dive into. Okay. And then I go through what are your channels. And I think this box confuses people because they think, well, is this an acquisition channel or is this a distribution channel? And the answer is yes, it's both. So depending on where you're at, being able to acquire and distribute your value to the customers is really important. And so think of, how do I reach them? Is it even internal or external? I work with all kinds of different companies. Yuri mentioned Toyota, which was a super interesting experience for me. I felt like an imposter being at Toyota trying to teach them lean startup, but I was able to do some amazing work there. Eric Ries went in and kind of got them excited about it, and then I helped them kind of implement it. And a lot of it's like, wow, you think about the next generation of car. Your car is like a service. What's your channel look like there? It's not traditional. It may not even be dealerships, right? It's something very, very different. And then what are the relationships that you have with the customer? What's the nature of the relationship? Is it more of a transactional relationship? Is it more of a subscription? Is it recurring? I think out of the entire canvas, by far, this is the hardest box to figure out. Like your value proposition, it's kind of a tough exercise, but you'll get there. You'll be able to articulate what you're trying to do. But this customer relationship box, not a lot of teams I work with, and I work with startups, but I also work with a lot of big companies around the world. We have a hard time articulating what's our relationship with the customer in a meaningful way. So it's okay if you get stuck on this one. Almost everybody does. But being able to think through what's the nature of the relationship with your customer. And then how do you generate revenue? Okay. And so if you notice from a risk perspective, a lot of your risk often starts off with desirability. And that is the kind of do they question, all those jobs to be done questions, the problem solution fit questions, all those, is there a need here? Am I able to reach the people? And is there something of value I'm delivering to them? Okay. Now, it doesn't mean you always follow these numbers, but pretty much 9 times out of 10, if I'm working with a company or a team, this is sort of where they start, because it doesn't matter if they build the whole thing. If they fail here, they kind of fail in a big way, because they can spend a lot of money on the backstage building. And unfortunately, they will not have, basically they'll always have churn, right? Like, they're never going to have adoption, and people will stick to the product if nobody really, needs it or wants it. But on the backstage, you do have to figure this stuff out with what are the key activities that you're working on. So think of verbs. I usually use verbs here. Like, what are the key things you need to be doing to make this work, okay? And then resources are more of kind of nouns. And so think of digital or physical resources. Sometimes there's patents in here. Sometimes there's, I have a hard time putting people in here because I don't want to think people are a resource. But if you think of your brand, you think of hardware, factory, like all this stuff that you need to make it work, all right? And then what are the costs? And so quite often you can find out what your costs are just by kind of looking at, okay, what are the key activities we need to be doing? And then what are the things we need? And how much does that cost? So it's kind of really, there's a lot of overlap there, although your cost structure, you're talking about what are the actual costs incurred. And then who do you partner with is usually last. Again, this doesn't always have to flow this way, but most of the time, this is how I see it happen. And so I had the pleasure, so writing the book with Alex was a great experience. And I have a whole different talk on how we tested the book. So if you, maybe in the Q&A, I could talk about it, but we applied all these principles to the book, creating the book, which was a pretty interesting way to write a book, I have to say. But I spent a week with him in Switzerland, and I had kind of played with this tool probably starting around 2011 or 12. I went to his masterclass in 2011 or 12 in San Francisco. And by then I'd already kind of learned some bad habits using this tool. And I never really understood the backstory about how it became kind of this thing. And really it's a lot of systems thinking, and a lot of, it was almost like a UML like systems thinking diagram that he shared with me, like he and Eve, his co-author. And so when you look at it, it kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, how do I deliver my value to the customer? How do I build relationships with them? Okay. How do they generate revenue? And it's not always, it could be multi-sided. If I had like sketched out Google here, we would have people using Google like you and I, and then we would have advertisers there who are basically paying to get in front of us, So we don't typically usually pay for Google, but we need to be there for it to work. And the revenue is generated from the advertisers, because they're basically is advertising. If you look at backstage, when you think feasibility, so this whole, can we do this? Well, you start looking at your activities and your resources and you say, well, that impacts our cost, so we can pull our costs from there. And oh, by the way, cost should probably be less than revenue eventually, because otherwise your model's not going to work. And then if you partner with somebody, it's because they bring an activity or a resource to help you create your value proposition. And when you start looking at it this way, I feel it's much more useful. You can start seeing the relationships between things. And so if you, like at the first startup I joined, we switched from sort of like, I don't want to say elderly consumers, but it was certainly older people who were purchasing annuities, to financial advisors who worked at investment banks. That had ripple effects in our entire company. The channels we used were different. We had to have more B2B sales. Our whole revenue structure changed because we had a platform and we were charging per transaction to basically transfer money on behalf of these financial advisors. And so it had ripple effects in our whole strategy. And I think where you're going to get value out of something like this is understanding the relationships and not taking this kind of check the box exercise that I see a lot of. I work with a lot of startup accelerators, and they kind of take that approach where they just say, well, yep, got a value prop, yep, got a channel, yep, got a customer. It's going to really have much more value if you can see the relationships between things. And then in addition to that, looking at the kind of risk that you have. And you'll notice value prop, customer relationship, channel, segments, a lot of that's a desirability risk, okay? Viability, the kind of should we even be doing this risk. Now, moral and ethical aside, right? You still need a strong moral compass when you're building a business. But if you look at financial viability, cost and revenue, you have some assumptions there that you have to work through. And then on the backstage, feasibility, can you really perform these activities? Can you get these resources? And can you partner with people who, it's kind of this build, borrow, buy conversation where if you can't do it, you can partner with somebody that can complement what you're doing and kind of help you execute. And that's all the can we run the infrastructure? And so something I would stress here is it's not just technical feasibility. I think that's where I kind of differ from the IDEO guys and some of the traditional design thinking, kind of framing of desirable, viable, feasible. If you go out there and research it, you're going to hear a lot about technical feasibility. And that is important. However, there are a lot of things that could also get in your way, like regulations, because I deal with healthcare and pharma. It could be governance in your own company. There could be other laws. Like there could be things that, you know, in the US, for example, we have a lot of privacy around healthcare, right? And health data for personal people. It's HIPAA compliance. If you have a great technology solution for a hospital, but it violates HIPAA compliance, you're still going to fail. It's still not feasible, even though you can technically build the thing, right? So I thought I'd just walk you through, because this is really kind of the basis of laying the foundation of jumping into testing. So I'll kind of scroll down here and give you a kind of a better overview of, let me actually zoom in a little bigger like that. So what we've done is we sort of just built on what Alex had already sort of started about 10 years ago, which is you have a canvas, don't treat it as fact, write down your assumptions, and you'll notice I like orange, green, and blue, but it's up to you what colors you use. And then bring those assumptions over and map them. And so, you know, I use orange for desirability, I use green for viability, and I use blue for feasibility. But the only reason I do that is so that you can see different layers of types of risk you have when you do this mapping. I've ran this exercise with hundreds of teams over the years, and I don't know how many have been following my work for a long time, but the labels have changed a little bit. So important, unimportant, still the same. It's important to the business. So if you write something, we believe that, ... and you're writing those assumptions down and you pull them over, then you have to be able as a team to say, how important is this for us to succeed? Like if this is wrong, this statement, this belief that we've written, will we fail? Will the whole business fail? Okay, so that's a level of importance. Now, I know some people go, well, I only write important things, and I do appreciate that. Yes, you only write important things, but not everything's the most important kind of leap of faith assumption. If proven wrong, your business fails kind of importance. Okay, so that's what I'm really trying to help teams focus on. Now, the evidence and no evidence is relatively new. Alex and I had lots of spirited conversations around this, and we realized that when we were trying to do this exercise, and I first learned it from Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden, who wrote Lean UX, and I used to work with at Neo. And they worked on New York, I worked in Neo San Francisco. In Lean UX, you have a 2x2, right? And so I was pulling from them, I was trying this 2x2, teams were still getting stuck. And I started pulling from design thinking, trying to fix my facilitation, maybe skills or whatever, the lack thereof, the teams weren't getting it. And then I used to have known and unknown. And I thought, okay, so when I get these teams together and they're mapping out their experiments or mapping out their assumptions, what would happen would be sort of this, the really powerful kind of type A leader in the room would say, oh, I know this is true. And I would say, well, how do you know? And they would say, oh, I just know. I was like, okay, this is not working. This is not the way this exercise should be going. It shouldn't be like this kind of weird dynamic. And so I was like, okay, I'll change this to certain and uncertain, and that'll help. And sure enough, they put a sticky down. I go, why'd you put that in there? They go, well, I'm certain. And I was like, well, why are you certain? They say, well, I just know. I was like, no, this is not. And so Alex and I finally landed on, hey, do you have evidence or do you not have evidence to support this statement? And that could be observable evidence, qualitative and quantitative. And it wasn't until we did that where people would put a sticky there. And then I was like, why'd you put that there? And like, well, I just know. And I was like, but do you have any evidence to support that statement? Because it's basically relative here. And we're trying to say, do you have evidence or not? And they would say, well, yeah, I don't have any evidence, but I just know. And so it would, it's silly kind of, but it would change the dynamic of that conversation. One of the largest clients that Alex Osterwalder and I worked with, based out of New York, called it the clueless corner, which I thought was awesome. And they would say, you know, anything up here is kind of the clueless corner, where if this stuff is really important for us to succeed, and if we have no evidence to support it, we're done. It's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have like this amazing 20-week plan and you execute your way right up a cliff. Like you have to go after this stuff early, you know? And so this exercise, it's pretty funny. I put it out under just Creative Commons, and it's in the new book too, but it's been adopted by government, security agencies. Google now uses it as for all their design sprints. So if you go to Google's site, it's part of the design sprint kit as well. I hate to say it just works, because that's kind of a cliche consultant thing to say, but it kind of just works. Like if you're able to write things down and get your team in a room and go through this exercise, they finally have a way to have a conversation about something that they're probably already worried about. So it's pretty interesting. And then from there, basically, what kind of experiments can you run to match your risk? And so I typically focus in the top right first, just because I want teams to focus on what's the most important stuff that they have no evidence. And where I saw them get stuck was they know how to do interviews, they know how to use surveys, they might know how to do a landing page, and that was kind of it. And I thought, wow, you're constraining all your learning to talking to people, running surveys, and maybe throwing up a one-page site. And it's not going to teach you about all the different kinds of risk. Well, it's certainly not going to generate evidence about all the different types of risk that you have. And so that's why we kind of basically ended up creating this list of 44 different experiments. There are many, many more experiments out there, but at some point we had to kind of draw the line in the book because it's already almost 400 pages. But this idea of, can we list a way that people help choose? Because I think there's plenty of lists out there. You can go to like a growth hacker site or a lean startup site or kind of a user group, and you'll find a list of stuff. And that's not, there's lists of stuff everywhere is what I'm trying to say. But the list of stuff doesn't always help you choose what you need to do to de-risk your thing. So we did the mapping and themed everything. And then basically after you run your experiments, you come back and you look at your map and you say, hey, did this stuff kind of move? Or is there something new that we need to add here? And then also, like, let's go back and look at our strategy, because overall we might actually have to change our strategy. So basically what we did, and what we're going to practice here in a little bit as well, is we sort of applied a taxonomy to experiments, which was really ambitious. I had some personal crises going through this book writing experience, because the way I tried to organize things didn't work. It was clearly wasn't working, and we had to kind of come back around to it. But what we focused on was, look, some of these cost more than others to do. And so I think the most expensive one we have in the book is probably like a crowdfunding campaign, which is quite expensive. It could take you anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 US to actually do a crowdfunding campaign, a Kickstarter, Indiegogo that's well thought out and planned. It's one big costly experiment, basically. But there are a lot of things you could do that are almost free, talking to people if you don't compensate them, or paper prototypes. There are other things you could do that are really, really low cost. We included setup time and runtime, which means how long do these take to set up? from our experience? And then how long does it take to run these? And then what kind of evidence do they generate? And so talking to people or doing stuff in a lab setting is relatively low evidence strength, right? Because what people say is different than what they do. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk to them. I know people love to quote Steve Jobs, never talk to customers. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said, by the way. But you should still talk to them, but just be mindful that it's pretty low strength of evidence, because what they say, you have no idea if they're going to do it. Also in that same kind of vein, if you're doing it in a lab setting and you invite people into this kind of obviously constructed environment that's kind of like a lab and you're doing this stuff, it's still pretty low evidence in a way, because you're not out there in the real world running the tests. So just keep that in mind. And then something really high strength would be you're actually, actually having people pay for something. Like that's pretty high evidence strength. So we went through this, and we also categorized everything, kind of pulling off of Steve Blank's 4 Steps to Epiphany, who we reference in the book, on kind of discovery and validation. So kind of building on customer discovery and validation, but also kind of going beyond that and saying, let's go beyond the customer and talk about, more than just a customer. So basically, you'll notice that we kind of laid things out in different ways. There's tables, there's kind of this graph as well, but this idea of what's the theme, desirable, viable, feasible, or more than one? How much does it cost, and how long does it take? And a lot of these will probably seem pretty obvious to some of you, but there's some new ones in here that we pulled in. And then on the validation side, we started going towards what are things where there's a real value exchange, and it's not just kind of open-ended directional hypothesis work. And so you'll notice, like, well, I tried to write a book without using the term MVP. I was almost successful, but I failed. The kinds of MVPs that I actually see in practice, though, are concierge. So when you manually deliver like this white glove service of the product without building anything, you're just manually delivering everything. That's the kind of MVP I see with teams I work with. Wizard of Oz, which is the other one, it is kind of like concierge, except it's not obvious people are involved. So the whole man behind the curtain thing, which is something that sometimes you could do like a landing page, but then behind the scenes, people are manually creating the stuff and sending it back, and they think it's like an algorithm or something else. And then single feature, which you think about early days Foursquare, where it was just check in and that's it, or Hotel Tonight, where they basically, hey, it feels like for consultants who are very disorganized, right? You land, you didn't book your hotel at the airport, and you're like, I need a hotel tonight. And that's all it does. It just finds you a hotel for tonight. And then Mashup, which I think has become a lot of the no-code movement, where you can take Airtable and put it into a landing page and put it into something else. And basically, you can mash up a lot of technology to sort of create an overall, like, pretty much an MVP that you can test with customers and also test the backend and even charge for. So I failed. I tried, not to say MVP, because I do feel like it's kind of a loaded term at this point and it's kind of misused a lot. But my contribution, I hope, to the conversation is getting just like one layer below that word, that phrase, and saying, what are the types we see and what can really help us? And these are types that are really awesome. Concierge is something that I love doing with teams, because it doesn't scale, but they can learn a lot just from actually like doing the stuff manually and learning, and then baking that into their actual process and code if they do something that's productized. So I just thought I'd like sketch up a couple really quickly, and then we can do some sequencing. But you could take something like an online ad and you can treat it like an experiment, basically. So what I did here, again, pulling a lot from Steve Blank's work, I've noticed that teams, you want to find customers that have the problem, they're aware, and then they're actively seeking a solution to the problem. And depending on the products I'm advising on, the business I'm advising on, sometimes you're at the bottom where people have the problem, but they're not aware. Sometimes you're further up where they're aware, but they're not seeking. And sometimes you're at the top where they are actually seeking a solution, which is pretty interesting, especially in the B2B setting. If you go into sell and you realize they've actually built their own thing, you have a pretty strong signal that there's an opportunity there, because they tried to find a solution to it, couldn't find one, and then they basically just gave up and built their own. But the way that I try to use this with teams is I was working with a team where, early on we were trying to push, right, ads to our customers. So it was for mouth pain. And we used Facebook ads and we used Twitter ads. And we only had, I would say at best, like a 1% conversion. So that's people clicking over to the page that had the solution and be willing to sign up and be a part of kind of the early adopter program. That's not great. I mean, you don't want to place a multi-million-dollar bet on a 1% conversion on your page. Right? So the team almost gave up, and we realized, we're trying to target people with mouth pain, and we're down here trying to push things. But if we decided to pull instead, we probably have a different experience. So let's not give up on the first experiment that failed. Let's try something else. And what we ended up doing was basically just Google, called search only ads. Basically, when you go to Google and you search, it used to be harder to tell what's an ad, by the way. They've changed their UX recently and the UI, and it's kind of harder to tell what's an ad. But we said same ad, same page, just put it in front of people who are actively searching for mouth pain, okay? And it was pretty interesting experience. We got a 40% conversion doing that, okay? And so when you think about it, it's a team that almost gave up. They were depressed, they were demoralized. They thought nobody wants the thing that we're trying to do to solve a real problem they have. And what was really happening is we had to kind of treat things like experiments and say, we're doing a lot of acquisition testing here. Where are these people online and offline? And how do we reach them in a way where we can bring them in and actually test with them? And so here, I thought it was just a really great example of pushing was not working. But before giving up, we tried, hey, let's see if anyone's actually searching for the problem. Well, where do people search for medical problems? You probably shouldn't go to Google and search, but a lot of people do that. And we took that and we said, look, there's actually a lot of search volume on this. What if we just used the same thing and served it up there? And sure enough, that was the thing that kind of took off. So a lot of this isn't, you just run one experiment, it's a magical success, and then you make millions of dollars. Like, I've never worked with a team like that. It's always been, you run an experiment, it's kind of weird, other stuff happens, and then you have to try something else. So basically, I tend to go for almost 12 weeks. And if you run an experiment a week for 12 weeks, you should have enough evidence to know, hey, am I on the right track or not? And that's with a startup or with a corporation. If I'm working with a corporation, I'm working with like giant pharma companies right now. It's at least 12 weeks, like 10 to 12 weeks, because we want to test enough to know, not just do that one and either make a really big bet on just anecdotal data or give up because we're depressed that like what we expected to happen didn't happen. So you do have to kind of do this as a repeatable process. Really quickly, I'll just cover concierge. So concierge, again, it's pretty interesting. I've seen a lot of these and also Wizard of Oz, and they're just really fun experiments. I would bet a lot of the AI stuff you're interacting with right now is just people behind the scenes sometimes just doing like putting together stuff. We did one of the stories is with Adobe. One of the concierge tests was people would sign up for basically an image that they would want for a community manager, and we had a designer actually create the images manually for them and give it back to them. And we did that before building some of the Adobe products because we wanted to know would people use the actual output of the thing. And so it's a really interesting way to test because you test with almost the output first and work your way back into, well, people are finally using this. What would be the kind of product we'd create to generate the thing that we were manually creating? So it doesn't scale. And the designer, Scott, he actually still talks to me this day, so it's great. But he did not have a great time doing this because he would send stuff back and then people would kind of say, oh man, I didn't want that kind of train. What are you doing? And so there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of learning. But some of the most amazing products I've seen built today started off as something like this, where we just manually created the thing, see if the customers actually use it, and then learn from that. And then that helps inform the product design. And there are multiple apps I've worked on like that. And I would say one of the more kind of hilarious Wizard of Oz things that I've seen out of the New York office was a dating app for men, which was SMS based, landing page, call to action with a number. Men would text that number and a bot would text them back dating advice. So we say, hey, I'm going on a first date with this girl. This is kind of what stuff she likes. Where should I take her? And they'd be like, oh, you should take her to like this restaurant and this place in New York. But we had people from San Francisco, Chicago, all kinds of places all over the world texting this bot. But in reality, it was just a team of women behind the scenes all texting the men back. So it was a really interesting way to test desirability. Would people actually interact with that, or would they be maybe too terrified to text a bot? Shocker, they were not terrified to text the bot. Like, men are generally clueless about dating, and they would just text that bot all kinds of problems. It actually, we had way too much demand, so thousands of people signed up the first day, and that caused a problem because it wasn't built to scale, because it was all manually kind of Wizard of Oz thing. And then the men were being ignored by the bot, and then they got really depressed because they thought they were so pitiful that even the bot wouldn't respond to them. So we had to change that to a wait list. In hindsight, we probably would have did that earlier, but like at the same time, you don't expect it for thousands of people to sign up on the first day for something. So be mindful if you're doing this like kind of experimentation that you it doesn't scale. You'll learn a lot, but it wasn't a great thing that thousands of people signed up because we only had a team of like 5 women responding to all these different tests. So what I wanted to do with you all is, now that I've given you kind of an overview, is I have a kind of section down here with some experiments. And I think in the chat, if we can give people the mural link, you'll just join as a visitor. So no need to register or log in any way. You'll just show up as like anonymous skunk or squid or something like that. But what I've done is kind of created basically kind of the library, right? So there's a library from the book. I know we don't have time to explain every experiment in here, but I try to give you some reference of what kinds of experiments are kind of at your disposal. And what I thought might be fun is just trying to create something that you feel like would be a sequence that could help you. So if some of you are working on a new product at a corporation, you don't even have to name the product or the corporation. Or if you're working at a startup or you have a side hustle that you're working on with somebody, if I was going to let's create a new product, here's an example of something I might do, right? I might, I probably would start off with something like customer interviews, right? So I would double click here and I'd say, okay, I'm gonna do customer interviews. Now that's a great start, but again, we said that's pretty low strength of evidence. What would be the next best test that we could run to learn from that, right? And so we might do some like search trend analysis, right? So we might want to go beyond the interview and say, is there anybody, I'll zoom in for you all. I know you're in the board now, so you can see this way too. That we might go bigger and say, is there a search volume here for people that are actually doing this at scale in a region or geography? From there, we might do something like some paper prototyping, right? So we take what we learned from that and we sketch out some paper prototypes with people. We might take that and we say, after we test those, we might do something like a clickable mock-up, right? Or some kind of digital prototype that's a little more interactive, right? From there, we might do something like Well, we finally do an explainer video, right, that explains what it does, but it's still not necessarily built yet. You know, we're just kind of going through it. But what I'm trying to show you here is I don't want folks thinking this is all just a one-off thing. Because like I said, most teams I work with, it takes them at least 12 weeks to even know they're onto something at all. So if you think about that, you're saying, okay, well, what could I learn from customer interviews? And can I use that anecdotal data to go look for something that's like a trend? And then from that, can I actually sketch out something that might be a low fidelity solution, literally just using paper and markers, right? And then from there, after I test that, is there a way I can do some kind of clickable thing where people can interact with? And from there, maybe I have enough to actually create like a Dropbox style explainer video that would help me kind of showcase, think of like Dollar Shave Club, think of Dropbox, think of, I mean, explainer videos are pretty common now, but you know, is there something that you could actually test in a bigger way and even maybe even put on a landing page and just keep going from there? But you know, my point here is not to create like a 20 experiment sequence, but if you're working on something, I'm just really curious, are there a series of things you feel like you could do to know, are you on the right track? Because I'm going to say, like, with leadership and executives and stakeholders, they're not going to get super excited about you running experiments. But what they will appreciate, I believe, and from what I've seen, is if you're able to say, I'm thinking a couple steps ahead here. If I do this, then here are the other options we could do after that to learn more. And it doesn't mean that things don't change. You know, if your customer interviews are a complete bomb, you might go back and do another round. You might do something else. But I think what will help us in this initiative is being kind of thoughtful about, it's not just I'm going to try something and see what happens. I'm really trying to de-risk. And I keep using that term risk over and over again with stakeholders and with people inside corporations. We're trying to de-risk something so that we make smarter investment decisions, all right? And so the way you need to be thinking through that is, can we actually create something that feels like, you know what, if I do this series of things, our stakeholders will start understanding we're paying down our risk, okay? So what I'm going to do, and hopefully Mural can support all of you here, because there's a bunch of people on this meetup. We're stress testing Mural right now, so I hope Mariano and folks over there watch this video, so we'll see how it handles. They just released some updates, so we'll see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this for 7 minutes, and what I want you all to do is think of something you're working on, okay? And then down here at the bottom, just create your own experiment sequence. You know, you can reference what's above. Afterwards, we can do some Q&A. You can also share out one if you'd like. But I just want to get you some practice of what's a series of things from like low evidence to higher strength of evidence that you feel like you might be able to do to kind of de-risk the thing you're working on. All right. I don't know if we need any kind of cool music or anything right now. I wasn't really prepared for that. But I'm going to set the timer for 7 minutes. The timer is at the top here, so you'll see it tick down. And then after that, we can have some of you all share out if you're willing. All right. So 7 minutes down below, right where I created mine, just think about something you're working on. And then what would you do as like a sequence of stuff? Think of like 4 to 5 things that you would do to kind of take what you've learned and use it to inform the next thing. All right. Okay, go. All right, you have about a minute left. All right, there. All right, I think time's up. There's so many people doing experiment sequences I can't even see. You all are awesome, by the way. It's so cool to see everybody jump in. So I really appreciate the attention. It's late here, so it's nice. Okay. Hopefully, hopefully it'll stay up. All right. And Yuri, I'm open to how you want to do this, but basically, I would just ask somebody who is willing to unmute and go through theirs. We'll try to find it in the sea of experiment sequences. But if somebody wants to walk through at a high level what they came up with and why they came up with it, does anybody want to offer up their sequence to the group to discuss?
So I can kick off with my one, which is the so if you go a little bit down, it's the one that's small boxes close together with a little arrow pointing at them. So right in the middle of your screen, yeah, that one right in the middle there.
Wow,
so,
it's amazing. That was a great description because I was worried I would never find it. So all right, you. This one. All right, yeah. So can you tell me kind of what you were thinking?
So the real item I wanted to raise there was what I call the genetic mutation approach, which is to go through the experiment, but to end up with a one experiment that you can then vary by making small changes to some of the parameters, and then rinsing and repeating the experiment process against each of those variations to work out which ones are most viable, and then vary those so that you use the same approach that genetics uses in evolution to get a great level of fitness.
That's super cool. I once worked with a corporation who they were trying to build a machine to do this pretty much like a script. And so it was super interesting to work with them because similar to this, they wanted to run 30 ideas at once. And they wanted it to like generate the ads and generate the pages and generate all the analytics. And they wanted to just concurrently test 30 different ideas all at once. And some of them were just almost just like the same idea, but different ways. And I think it's one of the more ambitious companies I've worked with. But yeah, I mean, it's so much, you know, this is basically just like scientific method applied to business and to apply to product. And, you know, this idea of what's the hypothesis? Can we run an experiment? Does it generate evidence? Can we get insights from that? And then take that learning and kind of put it into action. And the action part is really important because it's like, the market doesn't reward you for just learning, right? You have to actually do something. But that's super cool. Yeah. And so, and again, and it doesn't mean you have to always just use what I have above. Like I said, I have 44 up there, but there's plenty more than those I listed in the book. So those are really cool. I like the genetic mutation approach. I haven't actually heard it framed that way. So thank you. On timing, I'm not sure how we're doing on timing. Maybe one more. Does someone else want to offer up what they created? You'd have to unmute somehow, probably.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Okay, how do we find yours?
Okay, good question. Where are we? How do I find them? So it is, let me circle around it. It's just to the right. There we go. Right. Of your create your own experiment sequence below.
Oh, so it's up here.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. So you made your stand out. I appreciate it. Okay. So you're gonna just walk through. Oh, you have letter intent in there. So really interesting. Okay. So can you explain kind of what you were thinking here?
Sure. So the the context is working with a startup. They've already got an MVP. They've got a couple of customers. So this is, and that's to a reasonable degree already validated. So this is about entertaining a new market and testing a new market. So that this would be, actually it's a COVID product, and it would be looking at another industry that could also benefit from this IoT technology, and walking through in the day in the life to get a far greater understanding of their experience rather than our assumptions of what it's like in their shoes. So really getting a lot of insight that way, and then determining in terms of desirability, doing a search trend analysis. I'm assuming this is an assumption that that they would be looking for solutions for their problem. So testing that with Google, and then based on the findings from that, testing it further by creating a simple landing page. So still in the search environment, seeing whether they can actually convert. The landing page having a pre-sale offer, and then from that having, as an output of that, having a letter of intent, seeing whether they're prepared to commit. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. I think the letter of intent, it's something that I don't think is utilized enough. I've seen it. One of the more interesting things that Alex and I were even reviewing, and just we judge it startup competitions and a bunch of other things. But you know, if a startup goes into a hospital, for example, maybe the nurses really like the product, but the nurses have no buying power, right? So are they willing to write a letter of intent or something they can almost use as a recommendation, you know? And if they're not willing to do that, then you start to realize, oh, there might not be anything here. And one of the case studies I have in the book was, it's like a smart sprinkler startup. And they would go to landscapers, and the landscaper would be like, yeah, I want like 50 of those. And they said, great, like let's write a letter of intent. And so we can start, and it's non-legally binding. It's literally just putting things in writing. It's not like a contract, right? And no. They would put 25. And they're like, wait, you said 50, but you only wrote 25 here. What's up? And they're like, well, we really meant 25. So, you know, letter of intent could be a really interesting way to kind of, it's a little stronger strength of evidence. Again, it's not legally binding, but if they're not willing to put it in writing, then you're starting to understand, maybe what they're saying and what they do, there's a bigger gap here than we thought. So really, really interesting. Cool. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
All right. So you successfully all stress tested Mural. So I'm sure. I was a little worried about this, as the amount of people that signed up for this. I was worried we would just kind of all lag together so much, but you all got through it. So that's really cool. All right, so yeah, I think we have some time for Q&A as well. So Yuri, I mean, I guess what kind of questions were you seeing from the group, and how can I kind of answer some stuff before we wrap up?
I've got one question that was raised. Could you share one example of an experiment for validating desirability, one for feasibility and one for viability?
Okay. That's a really interesting question, because that's how I first tried to structure the book, and it was a disaster. Now, I'll tell you why it was a disaster, is because so many of these apply in multiple themes, okay? And so I thought, and I've been doing this a while, and I thought, oh yeah, that's pretty clean, right? Just have a nice section for desirability, one section for viability, one section for feasibility, we'll be done. Like the book's pretty much writes itself. And sure enough, when I started thinking about it and all the teams I've worked with, I was like, well, let's see. So you do a concierge, white glove, complete, like I'm going to manually deliver the value. Okay, so it's testing desirability, because you're actually probably doing it with the customer, right? If you're manually delivering the value. You can even charge for it, right? It doesn't mean you can't charge for it just because you're manually doing it. So it also tests viability. And then you actually have to manually deliver the thing. So feasibility, you're also testing. So that one kind of experiment can actually test all three. And so this is where I really grappled with it. But for the most part, a general rule is a lot of customer interviews and things like that, you're usually testing desirability. If you're doing a comprehension test where you literally have people explain back to you what you just said, And do they understand what your value proposition is? A lot of desirability. Do they even understand? With viability, you think about like pre-sales, mock sales. There are things you can do to really narrow in on revenue and cost so that you're more doing price testing and anchor pricing against something. And then feasibility, it's much more backstage. Can you execute? And even like old school Agile, if you think of extreme programming even, a spike is kind of like a feasibility experiment in a way, because you're saying, can I actually even technically put this thing together in a way that it works before I make this big bet? And so most people pushed back because they're like, I don't know what this XP spike is, but I view it as a feasibility experiment, you know? So I think what's challenging about that question is it's really, really hard to test those in isolation. So I vividly remember at a startup competition, it was an international startup competition last year, and I was on stage and someone raised their hand and they said, I have tested viability. And that was it. I was like, okay, wait a second. How did you test viability in isolation? Like, how did you do price testing without touching on your value proposition, without touching on, you know, how would it cost to deliver, like, and how you deliver it? Like, so be mindful of, don't get too caught up in the themes because they do overlap.
No, she should
So
look into
they
it.
overlap in a way, like that Venn diagram, you usually see it drawn. Your market does impact your cost. Your ability to deliver the thing impacts your cost. So they are very, very interrelated. So try not to make, try not to be so strict on this where you feel like you have to completely isolate everything, because in reality, when I'm working with teams, those themes help, but at the same time, they're very, very related. Because if it's really expensive to create, then that drives up your costs, and then you have to charge more, and then that shrinks your market. And so it's all very much interrelated. But yeah, hopefully that helps. Just don't make the same mistake I do, is trying to like completely isolate things, because in reality, the one thing can test multiple themes.
All right, excellent. Thanks, David. We've got some more time for some questions.
Sure.
There's a couple of them that I've added to Morrell that have come through the chat. One is around, do you use the value proposition canvas with business model canvas?
I do. So that is a great question too. So, you know, it was one of the tools where I had a harder time early on. And I vividly remember Alex and I whiteboarding, and he's just like, well, there's this new tool. And I'm like, yeah, but I mean, can I just use an empathy map or just jobs to be done? Like, why do I need a new canvas? And really, I've come to appreciate that tool over the years. And also, you know, it's pretty much all desirability. You know, you think about it, because jobs, pains, gains for the customer, a lot of that's desirability. Your pain relievers, your gain creators, what you're offering is a value prop. Like, it's pretty much zooming in on the customer segment box, which is sort of like the far right one, you know, and the value proposition box, which is in the middle. It's just kind of a zoomed in version of all that detail. And so when I do this mapping, if I do it on a value proposition canvas, it's almost all desirability risk. And our experiments end up being things like, hey, can we do some card sorting or a validation survey or something like a buy a feature or speedboat to understand the jobs, pains, and gains that we ranked, are they even close to the customer? So I was working in like women's fashion, and we were working with women, and I had a bunch of women on the team. It was like functional fashion. And we kind of ranked like fashion and function and price and all that stuff. And really, when we tested with women, younger women ranked fashion really high, and then older women ranked function really high. And so we noticed that we actually had two segments of women who kind of prioritize things a different way. And we wouldn't have known that unless we had mapped things out and kind of gone and actually tested. So I tend to use the value prop canvas to say, what are the gaps between kind of what we're doing and the customer jobs, pains, and gains? And then what kind of desirability experiments can we run to learn that sooner rather than later? So I think it's a pretty good tool for that. And so it's almost always desirability risk though. So it's usually the desirability experiments we're running. And then we kind of build out from there and then test the entire business model.
Yeah, so something related to that, David, is around about using the lean canvas instead of the business model canvas, or having a problem box on your business model canvas?
Yeah, I mean, I use the business model canvas a lot. The lean canvas. So I know Ash Maria, he's an awesome guy. He's been very influential in my career. I love the book Running Lean and Scaling Lean, and he's an early adopter too. And he just takes a slightly different approach, right? He puts in customer, problem, solution, key metrics, how defensible is it, stuff like that. And you can use it that way. The themes look a little different. Problem is a lot of desirability. It's like the themes just look desirability, viability, feasibility. It almost looks more like stripes in that canvas than it does in the business model canvas. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty tool agnostic when it comes to what are the inputs to mapping out your risk. You could also just ask a series of questions and write those down, right? And so I think I'm less passionate. I mean, obviously writing the book with Alex, I use a lot of those tools, but I think in the end, it's really whatever tools you're using, can you write down the risks you have, and then can you map them, and then find out what experiments you need to run to learn about your risk. And so whether that's a lean canvas or a business model canvas or a value prop canvas or a opportunity canvas, or a series of questions, like however you want to do it, it has to work for your company. But being able to write those down explicitly and then mapping and then matching your experiments to that, I'm a pretty strong believer in, because I've done this enough that it works. It's just so many teams just don't have focus. And we have to really be careful in the Agile community and the lean community, because I've seen this over the years where we tend to get more and more risk averse, and we treat that backlog like it's just a list of things if we go execute on, we're going to be okay. And we're not okay. I've worked with enough teams that, I was at a startup where we were using Agile and XP, and we had all the stories around the room that we had completed, and we did daily stand-ups, we did retrospectives, we did planning, we did all that. And you know what? We failed big time. We just efficiently created things that nobody cared about. So we have to be very careful that we don't have this false sense of confidence when we're working in an iterative way. That feedback loop is really, really important. And so just be careful of, whatever process you're using, that you're just constantly talking about what's the riskiest thing, how do we go test it? Because you're probably doing both discovery and delivery to an extent. But I would argue that you never do 100% of just one. Like, you're probably always doing a little bit of both. And so try not to think of it as phases, try to think of it as something that almost never stops. We're always our risk moves around, and early on, it's going to be in one spot, but when we scale, it's going to be in a different spot. And so it's not just going to go away. And so you always need to be thinking about how you're going to actually test.
Yeah, I think it's also using which canvas works with your organization. Depends on how the stakeholders really like to be engaged, or what really works for them. I've got one last question, if that's all right, David.
Sure.
So if segments are quite different, would you do a canvas per segment and experiment per segment?
Wow, the consultant answer here is it depends, but I will try to be more precise than that. I use this canvas as a storytelling tool, okay? So you can put different colors, stickies in there. And so, for example, if we were talking Google, you could say, well, the people that use Google for search, that'd be us, we're like in yellow, and then the advertisers are in orange. And you could trace that story through the canvas with that orange color and say, oh, well, that's where your revenue is coming from, and you have a different channel to reach the advertisers, blah, blah, blah. Where it becomes less helpful is when that story breaks down and then you can't actually use it to tell stories. So at the point, and this is somewhat subjective, I admit, but at the point where you have so many customers in there that you can't tell your story, then I would say you need different canvases. It's the same with the value prop canvas. I work with teams that go, well, these two people are kind of alike, and let's just color code them and throw them in one. You can try that, but I find that if it's not helping you tell your story, it's becoming less useful of a tool. And it's really not about the tool. I mean, I know we just did a whole thing about canvases and stuff, but it's really about making progress. It's really about like de-risking your thing. So I would be careful of putting so many things in whatever tool you're using that it doesn't help you tell a story. And that's about the point of I start to unbundle things. But, you know, if you have 3 different customer segments and it's a pretty complex, like B to B to C thing, maybe that's warranted, but it's not going to help you unless you can actually like tell your story to stakeholders or other people where they get it. So I've been a part of workshops recently where it's kind of terrifying and also kind of awesome, where I had a founder come up to me and go, "This is the first time anyone's ever understood my startup." And I was like, that is awesome, but it's also terrifying that you worked that long on that thing and nobody understood what you're working on, you know? So I do think, you know, how we learn is through stories, and that hasn't changed. And I think it's almost like this art we need to rediscover in business, where, you know, these tools should support our stories and be able to just basically tell a story in a clear and coherent way, and be able to tell a story like, this is where our risk is, it's over here, and this is what we're doing, and this is who it's for, and this is how we make money. And so I would say any time where you feel like this thing isn't helping me tell my story, there's 1 of 2 things happening. One, you probably put too much stuff in there, so it needs to be simplified. And 2, there might actually just be a problem with your strategy. You know, when I go through at a corporation, they go, "We're doing this for this," and then there's some random revenue stream that comes out of nowhere. It's like, what's that doing there? Where does that come from? And they can't explain it. And so then we have to kind of revisit it and say, okay, well, this needs a source. Why did you put it in there? Is this part of your strategy, right? So I do want to stress, like, storytelling it's so important. And I know you all probably get that, but please just keep that top of mind when you're using any kind of tool in your workplace. It's just, storytelling is how we learn.
Yeah, and I think to add to that is what you were just saying. It's not about being busy and going through a whole lot of stuff. It's actually really learning and making progress, because otherwise you're still just burning through a whole lot of resources.
Yeah, the whole reason I got pulled into this whole, like, kind of, I don't know how I ended up in this career, but I just got really frustrated building things that nobody cared about, even if it was in an iterative way. It's such a frustrating experience, and to waste multiple years of your life and to your detriment of your personal relationships trying to build things that nobody cares about. It doesn't matter what kind of style you use, it's just inherently a frustrating experience. So I think it was kind of born out of that I ended up getting pulled into all this other work. And I love it. Like, I have this kind of superpower to help people see stuff and kind of pay down their risk. So, but it's born out of just nights and weekends building things nobody cares about. And it doesn't matter if you use Agile, Waterfall, you're still building things nobody cares about. so my mission in life is to help people not waste time doing that. And so hopefully, you know, well, this evening for me is after midnight here in California, but hopefully this kind of session helped you all kind of connect the dots a little bit so that you can also not fall into that same trap.
All right, I just really wanted to thank you, David, for all the knowledge and everything that you've shared tonight. I know it's really late, it's 12, yeah, it's just past midnight for you. Really appreciate this and sharing it in Australia. I think this is absolutely fantastic. I love the way the book actually ties the business model canvas, the value proposition canvas, the matrix around your assumptions and testing those. I totally understand the challenges you've had by organising the library. I've had goes at that as well. I think you've done an excellent job in that space. So well done, and thank you.
Thanks. And I also, by chance, if you don't mind the plug, it's late here, but I am doing an online workshop of this next week in Australia-friendly time. So the last time I ran this, it was Pacific time, and I had some folks from Australia go, "Hey, that looks like a really cool workshop, but I couldn't make it because it's in the middle of the night for me." So the one next week is actually on a friendly time zone for all of you. And it's basically taking a really small batch of people through this whole thing with their real ideas. So if you do decide to sign up, be prepared to actually work on your ideas, because that's where I get a lot of the fun. It's not so much the training part, it's helping people work through their own ideas. So yeah, love to, if anybody's got any questions, just reach out to me.
Is this visible, the remote workshop? Is that on the screen shared? All right, excellent. So it's on the 26th of August from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Australian Eastern time. So if people that are in Perth, slightly different time. It's limited to 15 people, which I think is absolutely fantastic. It's $446, and that's including a discount. If you go to the bigjump.com.au website, there's a link there that gives you the discount straight away. Yeah, we'll also be looking at sharing the videos through the meetups, and we'll also put them up on the Big Jump website. So other things that are coming up, we've been talking to Bruno, who's a creator of Playing Lean, which is a board game that teaches the lean startup and innovation. So he's joining us. He'll probably look at going through some of the experiments as well, and going into a bit more detail on some of it and how it relates to the board and how it can be used. It's an educational board game that's really useful for startups, but not just for startups, also in larger businesses. And he's got a wealth of experience. He's based in Norway, so you should see that coming through in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Yuri. Before I talk about the next Agile Brisbane meetup, just wanted to say that I've found David's workshop fantastic, and I think from what I could see from the comments is that that's shared by everyone in the room. So thank you so much for doing that. And for I think a book definitely worth getting. So if you have a chance, go on to Amazon and get David's book. Also a big thank you to Craig and to Software for providing us with a Zoom facility, and also a big thank you to David Berry, who organised the Everything Agile Sydney group, and Rowan Bunning as well for the Sydney Scrum user group, and also to Arthur, who helped us with the facilitation, Arthur Horapat. And also, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, that Beck is going to be doing a visual recording that we'll distribute. So on the next events, the next Brisbane Agile Meetup event is going to be looking at the heart of Agile. Now, as you know, the heart of Agile is based on 4 key principles. And the one that we'd be doing a bit of a deep dive on is the collaborate principle. And Tony Ponton will be providing that to us. So that's on the 17th of September at 6 p.m. So if you are available at that time, then go to the meetup and then sign up to that one. Another one that's worth going to is the Lean Coffees. So that's something that's normally held every 2 weeks. And have a look at the Brisbane Agile Meetup group for the Lean Coffee events. It's really good to go to those. And you have a chance to put your questions on the table and have a group of experts in the field discuss those with you. So those are my items. And back to you, Yuri. And also, sorry, one last thing before doing that is to thank Yuri for all of the efforts that you've put in, also introducing us to David as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's been a great event, and there's an enormous amount of people that have been involved. We're keen to keep the conversation going and stay in touch. I've also said to David, are you available for some follow-ups at some point? Yeah, I think it's been definitely a big success, and the interest in Australia. I'm actually really proud of Australians and the attention and the interest in this space. This is a space that's, I think, is absolutely booming, in the next step after the getting to know the design thinking, and it's really looking at how do you start do your experimentation in an effective way and building that capability in an organization, especially now with the pandemic and the changes in the world that are continuously happening. I think it's really is an approach. Yeah, keen to keep the conversation going. So stay in touch. We've got some email addresses here. Yeah, reach out. Always happy to help. And yeah, stay online if you would like to discuss more. So happy to stay for another 15 minutes or so, and take any sort of questions and anything that we can help, or stories that people want to share. It is it is about the community in that sense. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Yeah, stay in touch. And yeah, feel free to hang in there and share your stories.
Thanks, Yuri.
Anybody have another question?
You'll need to unmute to talk.
Yes, I
mute?
do.
Oh. Yep.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm finding I'm a consultant. I work freelance with startups and also entrepreneurs and larger enterprises. And I'm actually a certified lean stack coach, continuous innovation coach. And it's great to see this from the business model canvas perspective. And interestingly, I just bought your book, David, on Amazon last night. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. I'm frustrated with the New Zealand industry in general, because I'm passionate about experiments and about validating early and de-risking. And I find that generally speaking, there's not an appreciation in the business industry for the value of testing. It's sort of like, oh, this is time consuming. We have our innovators bias, solution bias. We think we know, and they haven't probably been burnt enough times to get cautious and go, yeah, we need to validate. So my question is, what recommendations, suggestions do you have to get over that hurdle to help kind of break the inertia in that space?
Yeah, it's a question I get quite a bit. I visited New Zealand once. I keynoted a conference there in 2015. I headlined it. It was in Wellington, and it was all lean stuff. So that was great. There was definitely some people I met that were passionate around lean startup and design thinking and kind of business model innovation. I also met a lot of startups while I was there that it was so interesting. Maybe it's the New Zealand culture, but they always felt like they weren't good enough or something. And when I was looking at what they were doing, I was like, you all are amazing. Like, I would put you up against startups in the Valley. Like, I don't know what it's probably this like it's a cultural thing. And again, I've only visited once, but I was really impressed with everyone I met, and spent some time in Auckland as well. And I would come back to, I try and, it's funny, we just did a whole meetup on experiments and hypotheses, but when you're talking to people, I tend to use the words that they would more use day to day. So I talk a lot about investment decisions. I talk about de-risking. And I think what you're pulling at there is people are kind of somewhat insecure that they're going to be able to do this and actually find the evidence they need to make a decision. And so they're worried about spending all this time running experiments and then it generating stuff that they don't know whether or not this helps or hinders what they're working on. And they're like, you know what, let's just go build it anyway. Like, why are we doing this? And so you really have to kind of find those leaders that are nervous about something. You say, well, what would it hurt to go check? And that's what I learned from Eric Ries, working with him in the past, was he had this knack of saying with leaders of billion-dollar corporations, there's like, well, they get paid for having all the answers, right? So yeah, I'm sure you're right, but what would it hurt just to go check? Can we just go check to see if we're on the right track? And it sounds so silly in a way, but it works most of the time, not all the time. Like, some people are not coachable, but I try to use, that kind of language and trying not to actually lead with the experiments. So it's just more about risk reduction and investment decision and placing bets.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that makes good sense.
Yeah, but from New Zealand perspective, I don't know, the vibe I got was like very self-sufficient, but very like not sure how to measure yourself against other folks in the world, and so some of that might be cultural. I find this in the United States as well. I spent a lot of time in the middle of the country last couple of years, and there's this whole like pioneer, we don't need funding, we can do it all on our own attitude, and I can't really knock them for that. It's, hey, if you want to own more of your company and raise when you need to scale, then don't raise any money early on. Like, so it's a cultural thing. It's funny, if I'm on the East Coast up in like New England area, there's this kind of mentality sometimes of, we'll just put our head down and get through it and just keep going and we'll be okay. And it's kind of, I have some theories that it's about the weather, because the weather's so bad that they're like, yeah, it's snowing and it's terrible, but I'm just gonna put my head down and go, you know? And they take that approach to business, and they're like, yeah, the customers don't like this and we're not getting the data, but we're just gonna go anyway. And so it's always like that interaction, the people stuff that you have to work through. But I would say whatever you can do to use words that they would use from day to day will help tremendously.
Yeah, no, that's a good call. We have a term called number 8 wire, which is essentially a type of gauge of wire, and that historically we've built a lot of things out of that. And to your point, we have a lot of smart product people in this country. I think the challenge is bringing the business owners on the journey. Yeah.
David. But that's not unique to New Zealand, though. I'm just saying that challenge, I see it all around the world, and so that's why I think language is really important too.
That's great.
Yeah, David, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Yep, my name's Jason. I've been in the video game space for about 15 years, and then the last 5 years non-video game. So it's been interesting watching that transition. And I came in as a customer advocate. I was one of the top esports players in the world back when esports, you didn't make money from esports. So, but it's been
timed it wrong.
Yeah, that's right. But the interesting thing for me was, I went through that whole Agile movement, and I guess they said, oh, we want you to be a customer advocate, but we don't know what to call you. So what do you want to call yourself? Can you create a prioritized list of things that we should do and we shouldn't do, and be the voice of the customer? So I sort of see it as sort of product owner before product owner was a thing, and also product management, moving into product management. But it was interesting. About three years ago, I got to work with Ash Moria for about 12, 18 months doing lean startup for Fruit Ninja, the mobile game. So we were taking Fruit Ninja to esports. It was like, can we do this? A super casual game. Can we make this competitive? But it was a very interesting journey to go through that. But the key learning for me, and I'm interested in your insight, was the decision making around, say, designing a feature, understanding a customer. That process is very well defined, and you make very good decisions, and it's quite a collaborative effort. And whether you're using things like de Bono hats, or you have some thumbnailing for art or whatever, but when it came to experiment design, it just wasn't the same. It was a real effort to get a collaborative effort around really good experiment design. People engage with the experiments, wanting to see them succeed, build them well. I don't know if you've experienced the same, and what has worked for you,
Yeah, no, you seem like you have a fascinating history. The gaming world is just so, well, it's usually not sustainable pace, right? But there's some backlash too, right? Because out in San Francisco, Zynga would just experiment like crazy, right? But then they did some probably questionable kind of experiments too, and so it doesn't always work out that way. You still need, like I said, a strong moral compass when you're experimenting. But I guess coming back to your question, designing experiments is hard. And so the biases, coming kind of back to the earlier question, people feel like they're just going to waste their time. And, there's like, well, I'm going to do this, but I'm probably going to bake my biases right into the experiment. And then I'm going to waste all this time, and I'm going to learn what I already wanted to find out. And so there's confirmation bias and experimenter's bias and overconfidence bias. And Tristan Cromer, who I also really admire, he's out here in San Francisco, is amazing at this too. But just being able to spot biases and kind of do some damage control. You can't really eliminate them, but you could do things like, when you're doing your interviews, not doing them by yourself and then sorting through all the data by yourself, doing it with a team so that you get different perspectives. There are some things you can do to kind of mitigate it a little bit. But it's tough. I've learned also in my work that I used to just not take enough time in experiment design, because I would try to rush through it. And I was always like, why are these people taking so long just to design this experiment? And, it's really challenging mentally, right? Because you have to say, what's the hypothesis I was going to test? How am I going to test this thing? What am I going to measure? And then what are the success criteria? And I saw one of the questions that fly by earlier today or tonight for me, which was, should we have falsifiable hypotheses, right? And so you do want success criteria in your experiment, right? So even Tristan would say like you want failure criteria, and Teresa Torres is a big fan of that too. And so it's kind of mentally exhausting to go through it, right? So I think not that you have to use all the tools I've mentioned tonight, but anything that you can do to kind of lead into that and not have it be so overwhelming, right? So for example, that 2x2 doesn't take very long to do. And then you go, well, that's something we're all worried about. What would you go do to test that? And then people have a jumping off point where they can say, well, we could probably this and this and this. And so I don't know if there's one really great solution to it, but I would just be careful of overwhelming people with, okay, now you have, it's just mentally, I remember going early days, Lean Startup Circle, San Francisco, and we had Edmunds.com there. And we were like, that's an amazing story. Are your people still working that way? And he's like, no, of course not. He's like, it's mentally exhausting to work that way. And they just needed a break. And I thought, oh no, it was like such a great talk. And we were all excited about how they're experimenting through like selling cars. And they're like, oh yeah, we don't want to do that ever again. So I do think we have to like, kind of meet people maybe a half a step ahead of where they are, and not just push this whole thing on them in a way that's just overwhelming, and they're worried they're going to waste a bunch of time and then not learn what they want to, they're basically just going to explain away anything that doesn't agree with what they're doing. So
well, David, just to share, like the games industry's really shifted now because it's barrier to entry is really low, and you can lose a lot of money very quickly, and what's happened is we've got a lot of science people coming in. So a lot of people, researchers. So what happens is you bring in this methodology of experiment and this, the scientific method applied to business. So as soon as you say that, they're going, statistical significance, and we need 5,000 users, and there's bias with this, bias with that. But what I usually find is people just want to build what they want to build, and they want to be left alone, and they'll find any reason. And I remember I listened to one lady, it was at a gaming conference, where she said, business is more art than science. So yes, we're applying a scientific method, but we're not going to get 100 users is good enough is statistically significant enough. We assume normal distribution, we assume that. And I must admit, I had the most success just running design sprints. Like you said, 3 months of design sprints, week after week. Were they the best experiments? Were they? No, but we learned a heap. The team was had lots of empathy for the user. And then the other thing was poker planning. You'd be familiar with the poker planning for estimating. Yep. Let's just do a fist of 5, like a poker planning on level of confidence in our assumption around 5 or 6 different minded people looking at the thing pre-experiment, post-experiment. And that was usually as accurate as anything else,
Yeah, just be really careful about some of the words you said there. Kind of
Sorry.
Some red flags for me because I had the pleasure of pairing with Tendai Vicky, who is now like an associate partner at Strategizer, and he also wrote The Corporate Startup and Pirates in the Navy, and he has a PhD, right? And we had this conversation a long time ago, and he said, this is more like social science, okay? And I think maybe that would help you too with framing, because I think when we get, like, it is like much more like a social science. Do we even agree on how confident we should be about something that we're building, right? And so what'll happen, and we did this in the London masterclass recently before like the pandemic hit, which was if you interview like 5 customers, you shouldn't be super confident about like the thing, right? And so some of this, I think we have to keep this in mind when we're learning and applying this process. Is it's much more like can we just align on confidence, because we should not be confident right now on what on the direction based on just this one thing we did. And so that helped me because I always have this imposter syndrome of like, I'm not a scientist, and I wrote the book in a very specific way to make it consumable, because I feel like when what you're talking about, when people come in and they start saying, well, that's not statistically significant. And like, if you look at scientific journals and stuff, like people are actually saying statistical significance doesn't exist now. Like there's all kinds of like turmoil within the scientific community. So I feel like that kind of approach just turns people off to doing it at all, So I'm okay with it being more like a social science, and knowing that, hey, we're going to learn and we're going to take that learning and put it into something else. And so just be really careful, because I do feel like a lot of that, it's just like the same reason why systems thinking is not really popular today. Because I think if you read systems thinking books, you're like, what is this? This is the most boring. But if you read like really consumable systems thinking, like Donna Meadows stuff, it's like, oh, that actually makes sense, and I could actually do something with that. So I do think we have to keep it actionable, and I think even Eric Ries would say that, you know, because Lean Startup was written like 10 years ago, right? And he got a lot of criticism for that book even, and you know, one of the questions he got was something like, well, or comment was like, well, why didn't you put any failed startups in there? And his response was like, I did, we just don't know which ones yet. it's like we're still learning, you know, we're still trying this. So I think it's pretty awesome. Like, you getting to work with Ash is amazing. Like, he's an amazing guy. But like, try to keep that top of mind. Is it actionable? Is it helping us make progress? And try to keep your kind of ear to the ground when you sense it's getting pulled in a direction where people are just going to argue over like a technique or a definition in a meeting. Like, you'll spend more time in meeting arguing over what MVP means than actually like going off and testing the thing. So just be really careful of that.
Just a
David,
last
I was just going to jump in on what you were saying there, David, and you mentioned that bit about social science. Well, I'm a social scientist. I do have that PhD, and I can run you through all the statistical significance and all that sort of stuff. And I was entirely agreeing with everything you were saying. Some evidence is better than no evidence. Forget about statistical significance. If your best evidence is not significant, you still go with it. But if you've got really, really good evidence, then obviously you go with that. It's the quality of your evidence. And I really like the way you were talking through what's your evidence, not how confident you are. But yeah, do I know? It's what's your evidence? It's great.
And what I try to frame in the book is discovery stuff is more open-ended, directional, right? So like, you're not going to know right off the bat if you're onto something at all, right? But you should be able to kind of run a series of experiments and like, are you even in the right direction, in the right ballpark? And so I tend to pick up when people already have an idea. I mean, I do ideation stuff too, but mostly it's where people have an idea and I'm like, okay, how do you test the idea against reality? And you're going to do some open-ended directional stuff probably first, and you're going to work your way down into, okay, I have a real thing that I can test and actually, you know, people will pay for, but it's not going to scale, but I know. But I think where people make the mistake is they start with just the open-ended directional, and then they jump way to like building the app. And it's like, you place a really big bet on something where you have almost no evidence to support you're on the right track. And so I've been trying to help teams just learn that you can do a series of things along the way and kind of pay down your risk. So, but we're all still learning. Like, I fully admit that, you know, we're all still learning this together. But I'm just excited about like the passion I've seen on tonight's call, and like, it's pretty cool. I haven't actually visited Australia yet. Hopefully when the pandemic's over, I could come down. But it's, I'm just really impressed with the level of kind of attention and how sharp everybody is and passionate about this stuff.
Yeah, we've still got 37 people.
I know. It's like 12:30 here at night, and I'll just talk forever too. So I do need to go soon.
Yeah. So thanks very much, David. I think it's been awesome. Thanks everybody for the fantastic questions and the fantastic engagement. This has actually been an awesome event, and hopefully will be more events like this as well that continue on. Fantastic collaboration between all the meetups in Australia, ACS, Australian Computer Society, River City Labs, and also Project Management Institute. So fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a fantastic night.